Greetings to all our new subscribers. It's so wonderful to have you here. From myself, Lara Replica, and Daniel Volt, we extend a warm and heartfelt welcome to our channel. We truly hope you find joy in the story we're about to share with you. I created the imagery for this story and wrote it in a way that blends reality and fiction. It's woven with parts of Daniel's own life story. Names may have been changed, but the essence remains. Daniel shared with me that reading the story felt almost like a journey through his past, especially the part where Dan first made contact with Lara on Facebook. It brought up so many feelings, moments of nostalgia, of emotions long buried. Before we dive into the story, I'd like to share something special. Though names have been altered, Daniel once had two very close friends during his time on the farm in Plett. The three of them spent countless hours together. They even began building a tree house, a project that remained unfinished when they had to leave for the USA. One sister was a bit of a tomboy, while the elder was graceful and ladylike. Just before they left, the younger sister told Daniel something he never forgot. "My sister likes you." But life, as it often does, drifted them apart. A toxic relationship with Daniel's ex strained their bond, and the older sister moved on with her life, becoming a single mother to a beautiful child. As we journey into this story, I invite you to take a glimpse into Daniel's past, a past that continues to shape the world he is now building. Daniel is not just developing a game, but a whole ecosystem, a project that aims to help millions by supporting charities through the funds generated by NFT sales. To learn more about this vision, visit www.mythicmasters.org.za. And now, let's begin the story. We hope it resonates with you, and that you'll stay with us as we explore the depths of what Daniel's journey has to offer. True friendship lasts a lifetime. Artwork and story created by Lara Replica, inspired by real-life events.
Chapter 1. A Bond Forged in Sunshine. The sun blazed over the rolling hills of Plettenberg Bay, its golden rays painting the sky with hues of warmth. I was 12, barefoot and invincible, running through the tall grass of our farm. That day the Jacobs family arrived, a whirlwind of laughter and new faces. Lara, her sister Emma, and I were inseparable from the start. We climbed trees, built forts, and shared secrets like we'd known each other forever. Lara, 6 years younger than me, was quieter than Emma, but had a spark that caught my attention. Her hazel eyes lit up when she smiled, her laughter carrying over the breeze like a song. Our parents became fast friends, sharing coffee and stories while we kids ran wild. My mom and dad were happy to have the Jacobs over. Finally, another family to break the quiet monotony of rural life. Even Lara's older brothers, Mark and Caleb, sometimes joined in, though they were more interested in practicing drums and guitar in the evenings. The first day they visited, we decided to build a treehouse on our farm. Emma was the ringleader, delegating tasks as Lara quietly watched. But when I suggested a design, Lara surprised me with ideas that outshone mine. She was smart, resourceful, and I'd later realize, quietly dressing her best whenever I was around. But back then, I was too naive to understand the stolen glances or the way she blushed when I caught her looking. Those days felt endless. Lara, Emma, and I built more than a treehouse that summer. We built a bond that would last through time, or so I thought. Little did I know, the foundation we'd laid would soon be tested in ways I couldn't imagine.
Chapter 2. Lara's Early Feelings. Lara's POV. I never told anyone, not even Emma, but I had a secret crush on Dan. From the moment we arrived at his farm, something about him pulled me in. He was older, stronger, and always seemed so carefree, as if the world was just a place to explore with no worries. His laugh echoed through the fields, his blue eyes sparkling with a mischievous gleam. I wasn't like Emma. She was always the confident one, the leader. I was quieter, more reserved, preferring to watch rather than take charge. But Dan, he made me feel like I was seen. He'd throw me a smile when I came up with an idea for the treehouse, or compliment me on something I hadn't even thought about. The truth was, every time he came to visit, I tried my hardest to look my best. I would pick out my favorite dresses, brush my hair until it shone, hoping he would notice me the way I noticed him. But he never did. I told myself it didn't matter, that we were just friends, that nothing had to change. When we played together, it was easy to forget how I felt, how much I wanted him to look at me with the same affection I felt for him. but in the quiet moments when everyone else was distracted, I couldn't stop the way my heart raced when he was near. Then, the day came when my family had to leave South Africa. It was as if the world was suddenly in a rush, like time had been shortened. I didn't want to leave. Not just the place, but Dan, too. I'd barely had time to process it all, and suddenly I was sitting in the back of the car, my family saying their final goodbyes. Dan was there, standing at the gate, his face just as I remembered it, kind and familiar, but now strangely distant. I tried to act normal, but I felt this tight knot in my chest. It was almost like I was avoiding him. I couldn't even look him in the eyes. Just before we left, Emma turned to me with that knowing look of hers and whispered, "Lara, he likes you too." And just like that, I realized the one thing I'd been too scared to admit all along. But it was too late. We were already miles apart.
Chapter 3. Departure and Regret. The morning the Jacobs family left felt like any other, until it didn't. Their old station wagon sat packed to the brim with suitcases and boxes. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, families moved all the time. But as I watched Lara and Emma linger on the porch, something inside me twisted. Lara wasn't herself that day. Normally she'd join in whatever nonsense Emma and I were up to, laughing at our ridiculous games. But that morning she was quiet, distant. When I tried to talk to her, she gave me short answers, her eyes darting everywhere but at me. Emma pulled me aside at one point and whispered, "Don't take it personally. Lara's upset because we're leaving and because she likes you." The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. Lara liked me? Suddenly all the little things she'd done, dressing up, the way she smiled when I complimented her ideas, clicked into place. But before I could make sense of it, time ran out. Their family was piling into the car, Emma giving me one last high five and telling me to write. I scanned the crowd for Lara, my chest tightening. She was standing off to the side, her arms crossed, her eyes red. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't even say goodbye. But just as her dad started the car, she rushed over, wrapping her arms around me in a hug so tight it almost hurt. "Goodbye, Dan," she whispered, her voice trembling, and then she was gone. As the car disappeared down the dusty farm road, I stood frozen, replaying Emma's words. She liked me. She had liked me all along, and I'd been too blind to notice, or too scared to admit I liked her too. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the things I should have said. The regret sank deeper with each passing moment. I wondered if we'd ever see each other again, or if this was how our story ended.
Chapter 4. Letters Across the Ocean. For a while, I didn't know how to cope with the void left by leaving South Africa. The long flight to the USA was a blur, and when we finally arrived, everything felt different. New house, new school, new friends. Everything was changing, except for one thing: my thoughts about Dan. At first, I tried to distract myself, keeping busy with school and spending time with Emma, but the memories of the farm in Plettenberg Bay, the laughter we'd shared, and especially Dan, never left my mind. He had been such a big part of those last few months before we left. Then one day, Emma handed me a letter. It was from Dan. He had written to say goodbye, to tell me that he missed me already, and to share memories of our last day together. The words on the page seemed to breathe life back into the part of me I'd tried to bury. I smiled, feeling the warmth of his words wrap around me. It didn't take long before I wrote back. I told him about life in the USA, how much I missed the simplicity of South Africa, and how strange it was not to see him every day. I asked about the treehouse we'd built and whether it was still standing. And then, at the bottom of the letter, I wrote something I hadn't even admitted to myself until that moment. "I think about you often." Weeks passed, and each time a letter arrived, my heart skipped a beat. Dan's words became my lifeline, a connection to a place I'd left behind and a person who had unknowingly taken up space in my heart. But as the months turned to years, the letters became fewer. The excitement faded as life in the USA took over. I started to make new friends, get involved in new activities, but Dan was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Eventually, we stopped writing. My life moved on, his did too. I wondered if he had ever received my last letter. Had he felt the same way I did? Would he even remember me now?
Chapter 5. Reunion after 10 years. 10 years had passed since the Jacobs family left South Africa. 10 years since I last saw Lara. Life had changed for me in ways I couldn't have imagined. Jobs, heartbreak, responsibilities. But even after all that time, the memory of her never quite faded. When I heard they were visiting South Africa, my heart leapt. The Jacobs were coming back, if only for a short trip, and they wanted to stop by my family's home in Sedgefield. The news filled me with a mix of excitement and nerves. Would Lara still be the same girl I'd known, or had time changed her completely? The day of their visit, I busied myself cleaning the yard, fixing small things around the house, anything to keep my hands from shaking. When their car finally pulled into the driveway, my breath caught. Lara stepped out, and for a moment it felt like no time had passed. She was older, more poised, her hair longer, her smile softer, but those hazel eyes were still the same, and when she spotted me, they lit up. "Dan!" she called, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't realized I missed. We hugged awkwardly at first, the weight of the years between us making the moment both familiar and strange. But as we all sat down, her parents, Emma and Lara, it felt like stepping into an old favorite book. Stories of the past spilled out, laughter filling the room as we recounted our wild childhood days. Later, Lara and I walked outside, leaving the others to catch up. We strolled down the path that led to where the treehouse once stood. It was nothing more than a few weathered boards now, but standing there with her brought back a flood of memories. "Do you ever think about those days?" she asked, her voice quiet. "All the time," I admitted, glancing at her. "I've missed them, and I've missed you." She looked down, her cheeks flushed, and for a brief moment, I wondered if she felt the same. But before I could say anything more, Emma called us back, and the moment passed. That night, as they drove away, I stood on the porch, watching their taillights fade into the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story.
Chapter 6. Paths Diverge Again. The reunion in South Africa was everything I hoped it would be and more. Seeing Dan again brought back a rush of emotions I thought I'd buried long ago. He was older, of course, more confident, and his laugh had a deeper timbre now. But in so many ways, he was still the same Dan, the one who made me feel seen, even in a crowd. For the first few days after the visit, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he looked at me, how he remembered small details from our childhood, and the easy way we slipped back into conversation. It was as though no time had passed. But life in the USA didn't slow down for nostalgia. Once we returned home, the demands of school, work, and family quickly took over. I tried to keep in touch with Dan, messaging him occasionally on Facebook, but the exchanges were brief. Between time zones and busy schedules, the conversations dwindled. Then, Dan stopped replying altogether. At first, I thought he was just busy, but as the months stretched into years, I realized it was more than that. I had heard through Emma that he had gotten married. Part of me was happy for him, but another part, one I wasn't proud of, ached. I focused on my own life, pouring myself into my studies and later into my job. My family needed me too. My dad worked long hours and my mom took on extra shifts just to make ends meet. Emma and I did what we could to help out, but there was little time for anything else. The years passed, and though I dated a few people, nothing ever felt serious. I often wondered if it was because I was too focused on work or if it was something deeper, like the way my mind always wandered back to Dan during quiet moments. By the time I had Keira, my sweet little girl, I'd all but given up on the idea of love. My life was full in other ways, and I had no regrets about the choices I'd made. But sometimes when the house was quiet and Keira was asleep, I'd scroll through old photos, stopping on the ones from our time in Plettenberg Bay. In those moments, I wondered, did Dan ever think about me the way I still thought about him?
Chapter 7. A Toxic Chapter. By the time I stopped replying to Lara's messages, my life was spiraling in directions I never anticipated. What began as an exciting new chapter, a relationship that led to marriage, quickly unraveled into something I struggled to recognize. I met my ex-wife 2 years after the Jacobs family's visit. At first, she seemed everything I'd been looking for, funny, confident, and supportive. But as time went on, cracks began to show. Small disagreements turned into explosive fights. I convinced myself it was just a rough patch, something all couples went through. Then came the jealousy. At first it was subtle, questions about old friends, raised eyebrows at mentions of female coworkers, but over time it became suffocating. She hated the idea of me having close connections with anyone else, especially women. I stopped reaching out to people one by one until I was isolated from most of my friends. When I logged into Facebook and saw Lara's messages, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to respond, to catch up with her like old times, but I could already hear the accusations brewing if my wife found out, so I didn't reply. Eventually, I deleted my account altogether. It felt like closing a door to my past, though not by choice. Our marriage lasted 2.5 years, but the damage it caused felt far greater. By the time it ended, I barely recognized myself. I was bitter, broken, and distrustful. The lies and manipulation had worn me down to a shell of the person I used to be. After the divorce, I moved into my own place, hoping to rebuild my life. But the scars ran deep. I told myself I didn't need love, that I was better off alone. Still, in my quietest moments, I thought of Lara. I wondered if she was happy, if she still thought about me, and I regretted the distance I had allowed to grow between us, all because I was too scared to stand up for what I valued. Sometimes I'd catch myself scrolling through old memories, pictures from the treehouse days or that brief reunion in Sedgefield. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that those memories belonged to another lifetime. But deep down, I knew better.
Chapter 8. Lara's New Life. Life has a funny way of moving forward even when you're not ready. After losing touch with Dan, I buried myself in work and family responsibilities. My parents needed help more than ever, and I didn't mind stepping up. It kept me grounded, gave me purpose. Then, Keira came into my life. Becoming a mother was both the hardest and most beautiful experience I'd ever faced. Keira was a surprise, but not an unwelcome one. From the moment I held her, I felt a love deeper than anything I'd ever known. She had my eyes and my smile, but her energy and curiosity were all her own. Raising her wasn't easy, especially as a single mom. My parents helped when they could, but between taking care of them and Keira, I rarely had a moment to breathe. Most nights, I fell into bed exhausted, only to wake up and do it all again. Yet, despite the chaos, there were moments of pure magic. The way Keira's face lit up when she learned something new, the way she clung to me when she was scared or tired. She gave me a reason to keep going, even when things felt overwhelming. But there were nights when the silence got to me, when Keira was asleep and the house was too quiet. On those nights, my mind wandered back to South Africa. I'd think about the farm, the treehouse, and the boy who had been such a big part of my childhood. I'd wonder if Dan remembered me, if he ever thought about those days. Part of me wanted to reach out, to see if there was still a connection, but every time I considered it, I held back. What would I even say? Hi, remember me, the girl who had a crush on you 20 years ago? Instead, I stayed in my bubble, focusing on Keira and the life we were building together. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the thought of Dan lingered, like a faint melody you can't quite shake. Sometimes, I'd catch Keira staring at the old photo album I kept on the shelf. She'd point to the pictures from Plettenberg Bay and ask, "Who's that, Mommy?" "That's a friend," I'd say, running my fingers over the faded images. "A very special friend."
Chapter 9. The Turning Point. I'd always thought I was done with dreams that didn't involve practicality. Love, too risky. Adventure, too costly. But then, life has a way of nudging you when you least expect it. After my divorce and the fallout from working for my brother, I needed something to focus on, something that didn't feel like a dead end. That's when the idea of developing a game took root. At first, it was just a distraction, a side project to keep my mind busy. But as I poured more time into it, the idea grew into something bigger. It was a game inspired by the landscapes I knew so well. The rugged beauty of the garden route, the forests, and even a small treehouse like the one Lara, Emma, and I built all those years ago. I started minting NFTs to raise funds for development. It wasn't much at first, just enough to get the project moving. But as the pieces came together, I found myself daydreaming about what success could mean. One night, as I sketched out a new level for the game, I couldn't stop thinking about Lara. She and Keira popped into my mind unbidden, and with them, an idea that wouldn't let go. What if I could bring them here? The thought was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. I'd need more funding, significantly more, but if the game took off, it was possible. I could fly them to South Africa for a visit, show them the sights I'd discovered over the years, and maybe, just maybe, see if there was still something between us. It felt like a long shot, but the more I thought about it, the more it became a goal. I went back to Lara's Facebook profile for the first time in years, scrolling through her updates. There she was, smiling with Keira in her arms, her eyes just as warm as I remembered. My heart ached, not with sadness, but with the longing for what could be. I sent her a message that night, just a casual, "Hey, how are you doing? It's been ages." To my surprise, she replied the next day.
Chapter 10. Life's Challenges. When I saw Dan's message pop up, my heart skipped a beat. It was such a simple thing, just a "Hey, how are you doing? It's been ages." But it felt like more than that. It felt like a thread being picked up after years of being left untouched. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, unsure what to say. A part of me was excited, the other part cautious. Why now? After all these years, why reach out? Still, curiosity won over hesitation. I typed back a reply, keeping it light. "Dan, it really has been ages. I'm doing well, thanks. How about you?" When his next message came, it was full of updates about his life, how he was developing a game, how things had been tough after his divorce, and how he'd thought of me and Emma often. His honesty caught me off guard, but it also made me feel comfortable enough to share my own struggles. I told him about Keira, about being a single mom, and about moving closer to my parents to help care for my grandparents. He seemed genuinely interested, asking about Keira and what my life looked like now. For the first time in years, I felt like someone truly cared, not just about the surface of my life, but the parts I usually kept hidden. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I'd missed him. He still had that way of making me laugh with his quick wit and making me think with his insightful questions. But this wasn't the carefree boy I remembered. Dan had been through things just like I had. It made our connection feel deeper, more real. One evening, after Keira was asleep, I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't with anyone in years. "Do you ever think about the past?" I asked him. "About what could have been?" There was a pause before his reply. "All the time." His words lingered with me long after our conversation ended. Life was still messy and complicated. Between work, Keira, and helping my parents, I didn't have much space for anything else. But suddenly that thread from the past didn't feel so distant anymore.
Chapter 11. Dreams of a Reunion. Our conversations became more frequent over the following weeks. Lara and I slipped back into a rhythm that felt natural, as if the years between us had only been a brief pause. She told me stories about Keira's boundless energy, her family's move back to care for her grandparents, and the challenges of balancing it all. And I told her about the game. She seemed genuinely intrigued when I explained how I was building it, inspired by the landscapes of the garden route. I even sent her a screenshot of the treehouse level I'd created. "Recognize this?" I asked, my heart racing as I waited for her reply. Her response came quickly. "Is that our treehouse? Dan, that's amazing." We laughed about the memories, but her excitement lit something in me. The game wasn't just a project anymore. It was a bridge to something greater. The idea of flying Lara and Keira to South Africa solidified in my mind. "I've been thinking," I messaged her late one night. "If I can get this game off the ground, maybe I could bring you and Keira here for a visit, show you the garden route, all the places I've discovered over the years." Her reply took longer this time. When it came, it was cautious but hopeful. "That sounds incredible, Dan. I'd love for Keira to see where I grew up, and it would be amazing to catch up properly." That simple message lit a fire in me. From that point, everything about the game became personal. I worked late into the nights, refining levels, designing characters, and pushing forward with the NFT project to raise funding. Every milestone brought me closer to making the dream a reality. But it wasn't just about the game or the trip. It was about Lara. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice kept asking, could this be the second chance I'd always wondered about? As I saved another version of the game that night, I stared out at the dark fields beyond my window. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something real, something meaningful. I just had to hope Lara felt the same.
Chapter 12. Silent Hopes. Dan's invitation to visit South Africa felt like a dream. I hadn't been back since that trip to Sedgefield, and the thought of showing Keira the place where so many of my happiest memories were made stirred something deep inside me. But as much as I wanted to say yes without hesitation, reality kept pulling me back. The logistics alone felt daunting. Flights were expensive, and my life was already stretched thin between work and helping my parents. On top of that, there was Keira to consider. Traveling halfway across the world with a 2-year-old wasn't exactly easy. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I spoke to Dan, the idea of the trip seemed a little less impossible. He'd tell me about the game he was creating, how it was inspired by the garden route, and how determined he was to make it a success. His passion was contagious, and I found myself believing in his vision as much as he did. There were nights when I'd sit with Keira, flipping through old photos from Plettenberg Bay. I'd point out the treehouse, the beaches, the familiar faces of my childhood. "That's where Mommy grew up," I'd tell her, watching her wide-eyed wonder as I described the adventures Emma, Dan, and I used to have. "Can we go there, Mommy?" Keira asked one night, her little voice filled with excitement. I hesitated. "Maybe someday," I said, stroking her hair. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someday wasn't so far away after all. There was another layer to this dream, one I hadn't dared to voice yet. The more I talked to Dan, the more I felt like the girl I used to be, the one who looked forward to his visits, who secretly dressed up for him, who couldn't help but smile whenever he was near. But I wasn't that girl anymore, and Dan wasn't the boy I remembered. We'd both been through so much. What if the trip was just a dream? What if we weren't the same people who had shared those moments all those years ago? Still, the thought lingered. Quietly, hopefully. As I tucked Keira into bed that night, I caught myself smiling. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel quite so uncertain.
Chapter 13. First Steps in a New Direction. Every morning I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The dream of reuniting with Lara and meeting Keira kept me focused as I worked tirelessly on the game. It wasn't just about funding the trip anymore. It was about creating something meaningful, something that could bridge the years we had lost. The NFT project gained a small but steady following, and though progress was slow, each step forward felt like a victory. On the days when motivation dipped, I'd open Lara's messages and reread her words of encouragement. She believed in me, and that belief fueled me in ways I couldn't explain. One afternoon, as I tested a new level, I found myself smiling at the screen. It was the treehouse level, the one I'd designed to look just like the one we built as kids. I imagined showing it to Keira, explaining how her mom and I had spent entire afternoons hammering nails and dreaming up adventures. I took a screenshot and sent it to Lara with a simple message. "Think Keira would like this?" Her response came almost instantly. She'd love it, and so would I. For a moment, I just stared at the message, feeling an odd mix of happiness and longing. Lara's words always seemed to have that effect on me. Later that evening, my mom asked about the project. She'd seen me working late nights and was curious about why I was pushing myself so hard. "It's not just about the game," I admitted. "I want to bring Lara and her daughter here, show them the garden route, maybe even the farm. It's been so long, and I feel like this is my chance to make up for lost time." My mom smiled knowingly. "She was always special to you, wasn't she?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about all the years I'd spent wondering what could have been. "She still is," I finally said. That night, I stayed up late refining the game's mechanics, my mind buzzing with possibilities. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something real, something worth fighting for. And deep down, I hoped that Lara was feeling the same.
Chapter 14. Nostalgia Rekindled. The screenshot of the treehouse level brought tears to my eyes. It was uncanny how perfectly Dan had captured it. The wooden planks, the rope ladder, even the makeshift windows we'd patched together. Keira sat beside me, peering at the screen with wide-eyed wonder. "Is that your treehouse, Mommy?" she asked, her little voice filled with awe. "It is," I said, smiling. "Your Uncle Dan made it for his game." "Uncle Dan?" she repeated, tilting her head. It had become her nickname for him after hearing his name pop up in conversations so often. Over the next few days, I found myself looking through old photos and letters, memories of South Africa flooding back. There was one picture in particular that caught my attention. Dan, Emma, and me standing in front of the treehouse, our arms slung over each other's shoulders, wide grins plastered across our faces. The photo was worn at the edges, but it still carried the warmth of those carefree days. I showed it to Keira, and she pointed at Dan. "Is that him? He looks funny," I laughed. "That's him, all right, but I don't think he'd appreciate being called funny." The more I thought about those days, the more I realized how much they had shaped me. Dan had been such a big part of my childhood, and even after all these years, he still felt like a constant, a reminder of a time when life was simpler, easier. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through our messages, I felt an overwhelming urge to call him. We'd stuck to texting so far, but I wanted to hear his voice. It took me a while to build up the courage, but eventually I hit the call button. "Lara?" His voice came through, warm and familiar. "Hi, Dan," I said, my heart racing. I wanted to thank you for the treehouse level. It brought back so many memories. We ended up talking for hours, reminiscing about the old days and sharing stories about our lives now. Keira even made a brief cameo, giggling as she said hello to Uncle Dan. When I finally hung up, I felt lighter, happier. For the first time in a long while, the past didn't feel so far away. And the future? It didn't seem quite so uncertain anymore.
Chapter 15, Conversations and Confessions. Hearing Lara's voice again was like stepping back into a world I thought I'd lost. We talked about everything, childhood memories, the ups and downs of our lives since, and even my plans for the game. It was easy, natural, and as the hours passed, I found myself reluctant to end the call. Keira's brief interruption left me smiling long after we said goodbye. She was adorable, her giggle infectious, and the way Lara spoke about her revealed just how much she loved being a mom. It only made me admire her more. Over the next few weeks, our calls became more frequent. Sometimes we'd talk late into the night, the time difference melting away as we shared pieces of our lives. The more we spoke, the more I felt the years between us shrinking. One night, as I sat in my room, staring out at the stars, I decided to take a risk. "Lara," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "do you ever think about what might have been? Back then, I mean." There was a long pause on the other end, and I immediately regretted asking. But then she spoke, her voice soft. "I do, more than I'd like to admit." I leaned back in my chair, her words echoing in my mind. "Me too," I said, barely above a whisper. We fell into a deeper conversation that night, one where the usual barriers seemed to disappear. I told her about the regret I'd carried since the day her family left South Africa, how I'd wished I'd been brave enough to say something back then. "It wasn't just you," she admitted. "I was scared too. Scared of losing what we had, of ruining everything." Her honesty was a balm to the doubts that had lingered for so long. For the first time, I felt like the what-ifs that had haunted me might not be so impossible after all. By the time we said goodnight, something had shifted between us. It wasn't spoken outright, but it was there, in the quiet understanding that passed through the line. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time, the distance between us didn't feel so insurmountable.
Chapter 16, Keira's Perspective. Keira had a way of noticing things, even the ones I thought were too subtle for a 2-year-old. After all those late-night calls with Dan, she'd tilt her head and ask,
"Who's Uncle Dan, Mommy?"
I'd laugh, brushing her hair out of her face. "He's a good friend from when I was your age. He built tree houses with me and Aunt Emma." Her eyes would light up every time I said the word tree house. It had become her favorite thing to talk about.
"I want a tree house, Mommy. Can Uncle Dan build one for me?"
I'd smile, unsure how to explain the distance that spanned continents. Maybe one day? But the truth was, Keira was already forming her own bond with Dan. He had started sending little video messages for her, nothing extravagant, just him talking about his favorite animals on the farm or showing her parts of the game he was working on. Keira adored them.
"Uncle Dan is so funny,"
she'd say, giggling uncontrollably at his silly impressions of cows and chickens. One evening, as I scrolled through my messages, Keira crawled into my lap with her favorite stuffed bunny.
"Mommy, when can we see Uncle Dan?"
she asked, her big, curious eyes meeting mine. I hesitated. The question had been floating in my mind too, and the idea of the trip felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. Maybe someday soon, I told her, kissing the top of her head. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily Keira had taken to Dan, even from afar. It was like a piece of my past was finding its way into her world, and she loved it. The next time we spoke, I mentioned it to him. Keira keeps asking when she can see you, I said, trying to keep my tone light. I think you've got a fan. Dan chuckled on the other end of the line. Well, she's pretty great herself. And who knows? If everything works out with the game, maybe she'll get to see me sooner than we think. The hope in his voice was contagious, and for a moment, I let myself believe it could happen. Keira could see where I grew up, experience the life I had loved so much as a child, and I could reconnect with someone who had always held a special place in my heart. As I tucked Keira into bed that night, her words echoed in my mind.
When can we see Uncle Dan?
Maybe sooner than you think, I whispered, smiling as she drifted off to sleep.
Chapter 17. Shared Dreams. Keira's excitement about visiting South Africa made me smile every time Lara mentioned it. I'd never met the little girl, but somehow through our conversations and the video messages I sent her, she already felt like part of my world. One evening, as I worked on the game, my mind kept drifting to what it would be like to see them here. I imagined Keira running through the same fields Lara, Emma, and I had played in as kids, her laughter filling the air as she explored the beaches and forests of the garden route. But more than that, I imagined seeing Lara again, standing in the same spots where we'd shared so many memories, this time as the adults we had become. Later that night, Lara and I were talking as usual. The conversation had shifted from work and family to lighter topics, our favorite foods, movies, the places we wanted to travel. If you could visit anywhere, where would you go? She asked, her voice warm and curious. I leaned back in my chair, thinking for a moment. Honestly, I'd stay right here, but I'd want you and Keira to see it all. The beaches, the forests, the treehouse site. I'd want to show you the life I've built since you left. There was a pause, and I worried I'd said too much. But then she spoke, her tone soft but filled with something I couldn't quite place. That sounds perfect. I'd love for Keira to see where I grew up, and for me to see how much it's changed. We spent the next hour talking about all the places I'd take them. The Nizhna Heads, Tsitsikamma National Park, even the small cafes along the garden route. It felt like planning a trip we both secretly hoped would happen. You know, I said after a while, this game isn't just for me. It's for moments like this, for people to experience something magical, even if it's just through a screen. You're doing something amazing, Dan, she said, her words wrapping around me like a warm hug. And I can't wait to see it all in person, one day. As the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at the dark screen. For the first time in years, I wasn't just dreaming about what could have been. I was working towards something real, something shared. And with every step forward, I felt closer to making that dream a reality. Chapter 18. Struggles for Funding. Progress on the game was steady, but the financial side of things felt like an endless uphill battle. The NFT project had gained some traction, but the funds trickled in slower than I'd hoped. Every time I made a breakthrough in development, the reality of how much more I needed loomed over me. Lara remained a constant source of encouragement. Whenever I felt like giving up, her messages would remind me why I started this journey in the first place. You're building something incredible, she'd say. Don't let the setbacks stop you. Still, the pressure was intense. Late nights turned into early mornings, the glow of my screen illuminating my tired face as I worked to balance coding, marketing, and the overwhelming task of raising funds. I couldn't shake the fear that it might not be enough. One particularly hard day, I messaged Lara, venting about the struggles. Sometimes I wonder if I'm in over my head. What if I never raise enough to finish the game, let alone fly you and Keira out here? Her reply came quickly, as it always did. Dan, you've already come so far. Don't forget why you're doing this. Even if it takes longer than you planned, I believe in you. Those words meant everything. Knowing Lara believed in me gave me the strength to push forward, even when doubt crept in. But the challenges kept piling up. Marketing the NFTs required constant attention, and the competition in the indie game space was fierce. I spent hours brainstorming new ways to attract backers, even considering reworking parts of the game to appeal to a broader audience. One night, as I stared at my dwindling budget, I thought about selling some of my personal belongings to raise additional funds. It felt drastic, but I was willing to do whatever it took to bring this dream to life. Still, no matter how tough things got, the vision of Lara and Keira exploring the garden route kept me going. I imagined Kira's laughter echoing through the forests, Lara's smile as she saw the treehouse site again. It wasn't just a dream, it was a promise I'd made to myself, and I intended to keep it. Chapter 19: Small Victories. Just when I thought I'd hit a wall, small victories began to light the way forward. The NFT community I'd built started gaining momentum. It wasn't a flood of support, but the steady trickle of sales added up. Each transaction, no matter how small, felt like a step closer to the dream. One morning, I woke to an email that made my heart race. A tech blogger had written a short piece about my game and the unique story behind it. The nostalgia, the personal ties to the garden route, and my plans for connecting players to its beauty. The article was shared more times than I'd anticipated, and soon I was getting messages from people interested in supporting the project. Some even asked about the story behind the treehouse and the childhood friends who inspired it. I shared what I could without diving too deep into personal details, but the enthusiasm was infectious. For the first time, I felt like this dream wasn't just mine, it was something others believed in, too. When I told Lara about the article, she was thrilled. "See, I told you people would love what you're doing. This is just the beginning, Dan." Her confidence in me bolstered my own. I started dedicating even more time to the game, refining details, adding layers to the world, and making the treehouse level as immersive as possible. One evening, as I tested the updated version of the level, I thought about Keira. I added a small detail, a tiny stuffed bunny tucked into a corner of the treehouse, just like the one Lara had told me Keira loved. It felt like a little nod to the bond that was already forming between us, even from across the ocean. Later that week, I sent Lara a new video. It was a walkthrough of the game's latest build, complete with the updated treehouse. I added something special, I told her. When she replied, her voice was thick with emotion. "Dan, that's Keira's bunny. She's gonna love this." Hearing that meant everything. These small victories, the growing support for the game, the connections I was building, and the joy I brought to Lara and Keira reminded me why I couldn't give up. The finish line still felt far away, but I was closer than I'd ever been, and for the first time, I truly believed I could make it.
Chapter 20: A Childhood Memory Revived. It had been a few weeks since I'd last spoken with Dan, but the feeling of excitement never left me. The game was coming together in ways I hadn't expected, and every update he sent felt like a glimpse into a future I could barely believe might actually happen. I'd never been more proud of him. One afternoon, while Keira napped, I scrolled through old photos of us, photos of Dan, Emma, and me in Plettenberg Bay. There were so many memories, some blurry and others so vivid I could almost smell the salty ocean air, feel the warmth of the sun on my skin. The treehouse we'd started building all those years ago, the time we spent playing in the fields and running wild. In the back of my mind, I could still hear Dan's laughter, and it wasn't just the sound of a childhood friend. It was the sound of someone I had always felt connected to, someone I had never quite let go of. I paused at a picture of the three of us standing in front of the treehouse, grinning as we proudly posed for the camera. "You're going to love this," Dan had said when he'd first told me about incorporating the treehouse into the game. He had no idea just how much that meant to me. As I traced the lines of my younger self in the photo, I found myself thinking about how life had unfolded. I'd been so sure of things when I was a kid, sure that my friendship with Dan was something unbreakable. It was only when they left for the States that I realized just how much more there could have been between us. But here we were, years later, with a chance to rebuild what we'd lost, and I was determined not to waste it. I pulled out a pen and began to write Dan a letter, just as I had done all those years ago when we were too far apart to speak. Only this time, it wasn't about keeping in touch. It was about telling him everything I never could back then. Dan, do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't been so scared of messing things up? If we'd told each other how we really felt instead of pretending everything was just fine? Sometimes I think about it, how different things might have been. But then I remember that the life we have now is ours, and there's still so much to look forward to. I'm so proud of what you're doing, Dan, and I know Keira will love seeing everything you've been working on. Maybe one day we'll be there in person and you can show us the real thing. I can't wait for Keira to experience the magic of the garden route, just as we did when we were kids. Thank you for everything, for believing in the game, in me, and for giving us this second chance. Lara, as I finished the letter, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. Maybe it was the hope that everything could work out, or maybe it was simply the reassurance that Dan was out there, still caring, still willing to try. It was one of those moments where I knew, no matter how far away we were, that we were finally on the same page.
Chapter 21, A Visit in the Making. The days seemed to blur together in a haze of code, marketing strategies, and long late nights. But with every update from Lara, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her letter, though simple, had stirred something inside me. It was as if she was reminding me of the life we could still build together. The progress on the game had started to accelerate, especially with the help of a few backers who shared my vision. The NFT sales were trickling in, and although it wasn't enough to cover everything just yet, I could feel the momentum building. There was still a long way to go, but now there was a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, I sat down and made a plan. I had been thinking about it for weeks, and it was time to make it real. I was going to raise enough funds to fly Lara and Keira out here, to South Africa, to show them everything I had dreamed of. I drafted a budget, a timeline, and the steps I needed to take. The game still needed some polishing, but if I pushed hard enough, I believed I could raise enough by early 2025. That would give me the funds to cover their flights, their accommodation, and the 2-week holiday I'd promised. I couldn't help but smile as I thought about it. Keira's little feet running along the beaches, Lara's laughter in the distance, the three of us sitting together under the shade of the trees where we'd built the treehouse all those years ago. It felt like a dream, but this time I wasn't going to let it slip away. Later that night, I sent Lara a message. I've been thinking a lot about our plans. I want to make it happen. I'm going to raise enough for your flights, Keira's too, and show you both everything I've been telling you about. We're going to make some new memories, Lara, and I want you to know I can't wait to see you and Keira again. Her response came quickly, and even through text I could hear the excitement in her voice. Dan, you don't know how much that means to me. I can already imagine Keira running on the beach, and us having those long talks like we did when we were younger. It feels like a dream that might actually come true. And in that moment, it hit me. I wasn't just building a game. I was building a bridge, a path back to something I had longed for but never fully understood until now. A future with Lara, with Keira, and with the life we could create together.
Chapter 22. The countdown begins. The excitement of Dan's message lingered in my mind long after I had put my phone down. I hadn't truly allowed myself to imagine what it would be like. Keira and I flying to South Africa, the three of us together again, reliving old memories and creating new ones. But now that Dan had set the plan in motion, it felt so real, so possible. I had spent so many years thinking about what might have been between us, wondering if life would ever give us a chance. But now, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that perhaps this was the time. This was our chance. As much as I wanted to focus on the excitement of the future, I had to stay grounded. There was so much to consider. Flights, accommodations, getting Keira adjusted to a long trip. But Dan was already ahead of me, making lists, checking schedules, ensuring that when the time came, everything would be perfect. I often found myself thinking about what it would mean to be back in South Africa after all these years. I wondered how I'd feel stepping onto the same soil where I had once been so carefree. What would it be like to see Dan again after all this time, with all that we had experienced separately, but still felt so connected? Would things feel the same, or would they be different in a way I couldn't yet understand? Keira, of course, was another factor in all of this. She was just 2, and I had no idea how she would respond to a long flight or the new environment. Would she be as mesmerized by the places Dan had described to me as I was? Would she enjoy the adventure? One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching Keira play in the garden, I sent Dan another message. I've been thinking about all the things we'll do when we're there. Keira's so young, I'm not sure how she'll handle the long flight, but I'm excited for her to experience everything. I'll be a little nervous, but I know we're in good hands with you. The garden route, the treehouse, I can't wait to see it all again, through her eyes. Dan's reply came quickly, just as I knew it would. I've thought about that too. Don't worry, Lara. We'll take it slow. The flight might be long, but we'll make sure it's as comfortable as possible. And when we get there, it'll be magic. Keira will love it. I know she will. And as for you, well, we have a lot of catching up to do, don't we? His words sent a warm wave of comfort through me. The reality of our plans started to settle in, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace about it all. The countdown had officially begun. I looked over at Keira, who was laughing as she tried to chase a butterfly in the garden. I could already picture her running along the beaches of the garden route, the wind in her hair, her joy infectious. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this trip was going to be more than just a reunion. It was going to be a chance to rediscover everything that made us who we were, together.
Chapter 23. The Journey Begins. The morning of Lara and Keira's arrival had finally arrived, and with it came a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. I woke up early, far earlier than I normally would, the anticipation buzzing through my veins like electricity. The house was spotless. Keira's room had been prepared with everything she might need, and I had even placed a few toys in the garden to make her feel at home. I could almost hear her little laugh already, echoing in my mind. It had been so long since I'd seen Lara, and even longer since I'd spent time with her sister, Emma. The thought of them all arriving here felt like something out of a dream I had long pushed to the back of my mind. I took a deep breath and checked the time again. They were scheduled to land at the airport in just a few hours. Lara had texted me their itinerary, Keira's nap schedule, what time they'd need to eat, and where I should meet them once they passed through customs. It all felt like a plan that was coming together, but still, my heart beat faster than I thought possible. It wasn't just the logistics of their arrival that made me nervous. It was everything. Seeing Lara again, feeling the weight of years between us, the memories of our youth, and the growing realization that something was shifting. Something deeper was beginning to take shape between us. I packed the car with luggage and supplies for their stay. A small part of me was already picturing our time together. The hikes, the beaches, the small adventures that would make up the next 2 weeks. But the bigger part of me was holding on to the anticipation of what it would feel like to have them both here, in my world, in my space, after all this time. The drive to the airport felt like the longest journey I'd ever taken. I could feel my nerves creeping in, but there was also this quiet excitement. It wasn't just about showing them the beauty of the garden route. It was about showing Lara that despite the years apart, and I realized then, this wasn't just a reunion. This was a beginning, a new chapter. The past was something we carried with us, but the future was a blank page, waiting for us to write it together. As I led them to the car, I couldn't help but think back to the days when it was just the 3 of us, when life was simpler and the world felt full of possibility. And now, as we drove toward the garden route, I felt that same sense of possibility, that same spark of adventure, but this time it wasn't just a dream, it was real. This was just the start.
Chapter 24. The Magic of the Garden Route. The drive from the airport to Dan's home felt like stepping into a new world. As we passed through the rolling hills and lush landscapes of the garden route, I couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. Everything looked like something out of a dream. The vibrant greens of the forest contrasted with the deep blues of the ocean in the distance, and I could already see why Dan had spoken so highly of this place. Keira had settled in beside me, already asking questions about the scenery. She was a curious little thing, her eyes wide with excitement at every turn.
What's that, Mommy?
She asked, pointing at a field of wildflowers. That's a field of flowers, darling, I replied, my voice soft as I watched her curiosity unfold before me. Dan, driving with a calm ease, glanced over his shoulder with a smile. She's going to love it here. There's so much to explore. Beaches, forests, rivers. The whole route is full of surprises. I nodded, but I wasn't just thinking about the beauty of the place. I was thinking about us, about what had been left unsaid all these years, and what had already been felt in the brief moments we'd shared since I arrived. There was an undeniable tension in the air, an unspoken question hanging between us. But for now, I pushed those thoughts aside. I was here, finally, and I wanted to embrace the moments as they came. The car crested a hill, and ahead of us lay Dan's home. It was simple but warm, a house with character, nestled against the backdrop of a sprawling forest. As we pulled into the driveway, Keira let out a small gasp.
Wow, Mommy, look.
I smiled, glad to see her enthusiasm. The place felt like it was pulled from one of the stories I had read her at bedtime. The garden stretched out in front of the house, filled with flowers and a few old trees that looked like they had been there for centuries.
Welcome home,
Dan said softly, pulling the car to a stop. We both got out, and I felt a little thrill rise within me as I took in the place where Dan had spent his years. It felt like home, in a way. The warmth of the sun, the sound of birdsong in the distance, the smell of fresh earth, it all blended together in a way that made me want to stay. Keira tugged at my hand.
Mommy, let's go see the garden,
she exclaimed, already running ahead. I laughed and followed her, but I paused for a moment, looking back at Dan. His gaze met mine, and for a second, the world felt still. It wasn't just the beauty of the garden or the excitement of the trip. It was something more. As I walked toward Keira, who was already exploring a flower bed, I felt the weight of the years between us, how much had changed, but also how much had stayed the same. The connection was there, undeniable and strong, even after all this time. We spent the next few hours settling in, unpacking our things and exploring the house. Keira found a corner of the living room with a few cushions and turned it into her little hideaway, while I wandered outside, taking in the surroundings. Dan had prepared lunch for us, fresh bread, cheeses, fruit, and some of the local specialties. We sat outside, the sun warming our faces, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. Keira was happily eating, her little hands covered in jam as she giggled over something silly. Dan and I exchanged glances, and I could feel the old ease between us returning, that sense of friendship, of comfort, like we had never really been apart.
You know, there's a great little spot by the cliffs I want to show you tomorrow. It's a bit of a hike, but it's worth it. You get the best view of the ocean from there.
I smiled, intrigued. I'd love to see it. Kira's going to need a good night's sleep first, though. Dan laughed softly.
I think we can make that happen. I've got plenty of things to keep her entertained.
The warmth between us, the shared smiles, the easy conversation, it was all so familiar. But this time it felt different. There was an openness between us that hadn't been there before. It was as if the years had peeled away some of the barriers we'd put up in our youth, and now we were simply two people. Two people who had lived separate lives, but whose paths had finally crossed again. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself standing on the porch, looking out at the horizon. The sky had turned a soft pink, and I could hear the distant sound of the ocean, the waves crashing rhythmically against the shore. I wasn't sure what the future held for us, but in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of the past and let the future unfold in its own way. Dan walked up beside me, leaning against the railing.
You like it?
He asked softly. It's perfect, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can see why you love it here. He smiled, looking at me in a way that made my heart flutter.
I'm glad you're here, Lara. I've missed you more than I realized.
I turned to him, my gaze meeting his. The moment stretched between us, filled with so many unspoken words, but in the quiet of the evening we didn't need to say anything more. Tomorrow was another day, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited about the possibilities that awaited us.
Chapter 25, A Walk to Remember. The morning air was crisp and fresh, and I could already feel the promise of the day in the stillness of the garden. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the hills in the distance. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the first light of day spill over the landscape. Today was the day we would go on our hike to the cliffs. I had been looking forward to it, but more than that, I was eager to share the beauty of this place with Lara, to show her just how much this part of the world had come to mean to me. Keira was still asleep, wrapped in the quiet comfort of the room she had claimed as her own. Lara had been up a little earlier, slipping quietly into the kitchen to make breakfast. The sound of her humming to herself as she worked reminded me of the old days, those early mornings when we would sit around the table and talk for hours about everything and nothing. It was hard to believe how much had changed in those years. Lara had a daughter now, a beautiful, vibrant little girl who reminded me so much of her mother when we were younger. And yet, as I stood there, watching the sun rise over the hills, I realized that even though so much had shifted, something still remained, something that felt deeply familiar and comforting between us. I took another sip of my coffee, trying to push aside the growing tension in my chest. The quiet moments between us were too easy now, too natural. It was hard to shake the feeling that we were slipping into something that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to resurface. As I set the empty mug on the railing, I heard the door open behind me. I turned, and there she was, Lara, stepping onto the porch, her hair wild from sleep, and her eyes still half closed. But when she saw me, she smiled, and it was like the world shifted into focus again. "Morning," she said softly, rubbing her eyes. "Morning," I replied, unable to hide the warmth in my voice. Lara walked over to me, her footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. She didn't speak right away, just stood there beside me, gazing out at the landscape. It was one of those rare moments where words didn't seem to matter. The world was still, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of birds. After a few moments, Lara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place is beautiful, Dan. I can see why you love it so much." "I'm glad you're here to see it for yourself," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I thought it would be a good spot for us to visit today. It's only a short hike, but the view from the cliffs is, well, it's something you have to see to believe." "I can't wait," she replied, her eyes lighting up with excitement. Just then, Keira appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes with a sleepy smile. "Mommy, I'm awake," she announced proudly. Lara laughed and knelt down to give her daughter a hug. "Good morning, sweetie. Ready for our hike today?" Keira nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, I want to see the big rocks." I smiled at the two of them. It felt strange, but in the best way, to see Lara as a mother. It was a side of her I hadn't known, and I was fascinated by how naturally she slipped into this role. She was the same Lara I remembered, but with a depth I hadn't expected. After breakfast, we gathered our things, water, snacks, and some sunscreen, and set off toward the trailhead. The hike was easy, winding through dense forest before opening up to a narrow path that led up toward the cliffs. Keira skipped along in front of us, her small legs carrying her faster than I thought possible, while Lara and I walked side by side, talking quietly. "Do you think she'll be okay with the hike?" Lara asked, glancing over at her daughter. "She'll be fine," I said with a grin. "I think she has more energy than both of us combined." Lara laughed, and for a moment, I could almost forget how many years had passed between us. It was like no time had passed at all. As we reached the top of the hill, the path opened up, and the view took my breath away all over again. The cliffs stood tall against the crashing waves, the ocean stretching out as far as the eye could see. The sound of the surf below was deafening, and the air smelled of salt and fresh earth. Keira stood at the edge, her arms outstretched as if trying to catch the wind. "Wow," she exclaimed. "This is so big." Lara walked up behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder, looking out at the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured. I joined them at the edge, the wind tousling my hair as I looked out at the vast expanse before me. It was hard not to feel a sense of awe. The beauty of the place, the quietness of the moment, and the feeling of having Lara here, it all felt perfect. "I'm glad you're here," I said quietly, my words just for her. Lara turned to me, her gaze soft but filled with something deeper. I'm glad too, Dan. It's been a long time. And in that moment, standing on the cliffs with Lara and Keira, I felt something shift inside me. The past, with all its uncertainty, seemed to fall away. It was just us, here in this place. The future was a mystery, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it.
Chapter 26. The Unspoken Truth. The cliffs were stunning, the kind of beauty that made you feel small in the best way. Standing there with Keira and Dan, the wind tugging at my hair, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Keira, fearless as ever, stood close to the edge, but not too close, her arms spread wide as if she could embrace the entire ocean. "This is amazing, Mommy," she called out, her voice carrying on the wind. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face as I turned to Dan. He was watching her with a fond expression, but when he caught me looking, his gaze softened in a way that made my heart skip. "It's beautiful here," I said, my voice quieter now, meant just for him. "I thought you'd like it," he replied, his eyes searching mine. There was something unspoken in his gaze, something deeper, but before I could respond, Keira came running toward us, giggling as the wind whipped through her hair. "Uncle Dan, carry me!" she demanded, lifting her arms. Dan laughed, scooping her up with ease. "You've got it, kiddo," he said, spinning her around once before setting her on his shoulders. She squealed with delight, gripping his head as she looked out over the cliffs from her new vantage point. Watching them together filled me with a warmth I couldn't quite explain. Dan had always been good with people, kind and patient. But seeing him with Keira was something else entirely. It was like watching two pieces of my world come together, and it felt right. We stayed at the cliffs for a while, taking pictures and letting Keira explore the safer areas with Dan keeping a close eye on her. When it was time to head back, she was reluctant to leave, her little feet dragging as we made our way down the trail. Back at the house, Keira crashed on the couch almost immediately, her tiny body spent from the excitement of the day. Dan and I sat outside on the porch, sipping coffee as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon with shades of orange and pink. "I think she had a good day," Dan said, his voice warm. "She loved it," I replied, smiling at the thought of Keira's laughter echoing in the open air. "And so did I." Dan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It feels good, having you both here," he said after a moment, his tone quieter now. "I didn't realize how much I missed you until you arrived." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I looked at him, my heart racing as I tried to find the right response. "I missed you too, Dan," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, more than I ever let myself admit. The confession felt like a release, as if I'd been holding my breath for years and could finally exhale. Dan turned to me then, his expression open, vulnerable. "I always wondered," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "If things had been different, if I'd been braver back then, maybe we wouldn't have lost so much time." I reached out, my hand brushing his. "We're here now," I said, my voice firm despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "Maybe that's what matters most." Dan smiled, a soft, almost wistful expression crossing his face. "Maybe it is," he agreed. We sat there for a while longer, the silence between us no longer heavy, but full of understanding. For the first time, the distance between us didn't feel insurmountable. It felt like the beginning of something new.
Chapter 27. Keira's Joy. The next few days felt like they were passing in a blur, each one more beautiful than the last. The mornings were spent in quiet, peaceful routines. Lara and I taking turns cooking breakfast while Keira ran around the garden, exploring every nook and cranny with the boundless energy of a child on a mission. After breakfast, we'd go for small hikes, visit local sites, and let Keira play on the beaches that dotted the coastline. Watching her explore these places that had become so familiar to me felt strangely new. There was something special about seeing them through her eyes, her sense of wonder as she gazed out at the sea, her shrieks of joy as she chased the seagulls down the beach, her endless questions about everything she saw. Lara had a quiet kind of joy in her eyes, too, watching her daughter take in the world with the same curiosity that had once been so familiar to her. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of her smile, soft and content, as if this was the life she had always imagined for herself. But every time our eyes met, I could sense a flicker of something else, something deeper, a yearning I didn't have the courage to ask about just yet. One morning, after a particularly warm and sunny breakfast, Lara suggested we take a trip to a small, secluded cove I'd discovered years ago. It was one of those hidden spots along the coast, where the rocks shielded the beach from the winds, and the water was calm enough to swim in. Keira had been asking about it for days, and Lara had been equally curious. As we walked down the narrow, overgrown path to the cove, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in the years since we last stood together, navigating this part of the world. But it felt right too, like it was meant to be. Kira's laughter echoed down the trail as she ran ahead of us, her small voice calling out for us to hurry up. When we reached the cove, Keira wasted no time. She was already in the water, splashing around with reckless abandon. I looked over at Lara, who was shaking her head in mock dismay as she rolled up her sleeves. "She's always like this," Lara said, her tone affectionate. "Good thing we're near the water then," I joked, watching as Kira's wild, carefree energy made Lara's smile grow. I turned to grab our beach bags, but when I turned back, I found Lara watching me. There was something in her gaze, something warm and yet uncertain. For a moment, it felt like we were back in the old days, when we would share a glance that said everything we couldn't voice aloud. "You know, I never thought I'd be here with you again," Lara said softly, almost to herself. I paused, my heart thumping in my chest. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, but her eyes never left me. I guess I thought we had missed our chance, that the timing was always off, or that we had both moved on. I could feel the weight of her words, even though they were said so quietly. I couldn't find the words to respond at first. The air felt thick with something unspoken, a quiet realization that I'd been carrying for years, that maybe, just maybe, the time for us had never truly passed. "I think sometimes timing doesn't matter," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. Lara's gaze softened, and she turned away from me just as Keira splashed in the water, calling for us to join her. "You're right," Lara said with a small smile. "It's just hard to know, isn't it, what the future holds?" I nodded. "Yeah, it is, but we're here now. That's something." She smiled again, a little more brightly this time, and we both turned to join Keira, our footprints soft against the sand.
Chapter 28. The Moment of Truth. The days seemed to blend together in a haze of sun, sand, and laughter. Keira's joy was infectious, and every moment we spent together felt more like home than I could have imagined. Still, amidst all the beauty and simplicity of this holiday, a part of me was torn, holding on to something unspoken, something I didn't know how to address. There was a certain weight in the air between Dan and me, something deeper than friendship, yet unacknowledged. It wasn't the same as it had been in the past, but it was still there. The connection we had as kids was never just friendship. I had always known that, even when I pretended otherwise. And now, with the years between us, it felt as though those feelings had never quite gone away. I watched Dan from the corner of my eye as we sat on the porch later that evening, the sky streaked with pinks and purples as the sun dipped below the horizon. Keira had finally fallen asleep after a day filled with adventures, and the house was quiet, too quiet. Dan sat next to me, both of us wrapped in the soft warmth of the evening, the air still with the scent of salt and earth. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel his presence next to me like a comforting weight, but also like a tension I couldn't ignore. "I never imagined this moment would come," I said quietly, breaking the silence. Dan turned to look at me, his brow furrowing slightly, as if trying to understand my words. "You mean this visit?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. "No, not just this, but everything. You, me, Keira, being here. I never imagined it could happen this way." Dan leaned back in his chair, staring at the sky for a moment. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the trees and the occasional chirp of crickets in the distance. "Neither did I," he said, his voice low. "There was a time, a long time ago, when I thought we might never have a chance to be anything more than friends. And maybe we wouldn't have, if we hadn't found our way back here." His words were quiet, but they held so much meaning that they hit me harder than I expected. I turned to look at him, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. But this time it wasn't just the past we were talking about. It was now. Dan, I began, unsure of what I was going to say, but knowing it had to be said. I've been carrying these feelings for a long time. Even after all these years, I still wonder about us, about what could have been, and what might still be. I felt my heart race as I spoke, the vulnerability of those words settling between us like a bridge I wasn't sure we'd cross. Dan's eyes softened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me as if weighing something heavy. Then, slowly, he reached out and took my hand. The warmth of his touch was all it took to make my heart flutter in my chest. "I've wondered the same thing," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What if things had been different? What if I had known how you felt back then? But the truth is, Lara, I don't want to look back anymore. I want to look at what's in front of us now. I want to know if there's a chance for us." His words made my breath catch. I hadn't expected him to say it. The words hung between us, vulnerable and raw, but they were also full of possibility. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment I had been waiting for all these years. "I don't want to look back either," I said softly, squeezing his hand. "But I can't ignore how I feel. I can't pretend that I don't want more. That I don't want this with you." Dan's gaze deepened, his hand tightening around mine. "Then let's find out what this could be, Lara. Together." The words felt like a promise, a shared understanding that neither of us had to say aloud. But it was enough. It was everything. And as we sat there, the sun setting on another beautiful day, I knew that this moment, the one we had waited for, the one that had been so carefully tucked away for all these years, was the beginning of something new. The future was still unknown, but it felt more certain than ever.
Chapter 29. The Choice. The days that followed felt like they existed in a different realm, somewhere between the life I'd known and the one I now hoped for. Lara and I hadn't discussed what happened that night on the porch, not in words at least, but everything felt different, softer, closer. Keira was oblivious to the shift, her days filled with laughter and endless adventures. She had fully embraced life on the garden route, running along the beaches and collecting shells, climbing low tree branches, and pointing out every bird or bug she could spot. Watching her explore made me wonder how much of her mother I was seeing in her, the same curiosity, the same spirit. But it was during the quieter moments, after Keira had gone to bed or was preoccupied with something, that Lara and I found ourselves circling back to what had been left unsaid. One evening, as we prepared dinner together, Lara leaned against the counter, her fingers idly toying with the edge of a dish towel. "Dan," she said softly, her tone uncertain. "Yeah?" I replied, turning to her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I've been thinking about us, about what happens when Keira and I leave." The words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Of course, I'd thought about it too. Every time I saw her smile, or felt the way her presence filled the house with a warmth I hadn't realized I was missing. "I have too," I admitted, setting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables. "And I don't know. I mean, I don't want this to end, Lara. I don't want us to go back to just being distant memories." Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and I saw the same uncertainty mirrored there, but also something deeper. Hope. "I don't want that either," she said. "But it's complicated, isn't it? We're in two different places. My life is in the States with my parents and Keira. Your life is here." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "It is complicated," I agreed. "But maybe it doesn't have to be impossible." Lara tilted her head slightly, her brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've already waited so long," I said, my voice gaining strength. "We've spent years wondering what could have been. What's stopping us from trying now? From finding a way to make this work?" Lara didn't answer right away. She turned her gaze back to the counter, her fingers still fidgeting with the towel. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. "It's not just about us, Dan. It's about Keira, too. I have to think about what's best for her." "I know," I said quickly, stepping closer to her. "And I don't want to do anything that would make things harder for her or for you. But I also know that what we have, it's worth figuring out." It's worth the risk. Lara looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You really think so? I do, I said firmly. I've never been more sure of anything. She let out a shaky breath, and for a moment I thought she might brush it all aside, dismiss the idea of us as nothing more than a dream. But then she nodded, a small, tentative smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Okay, she said softly. Let's try. Let's figure it out. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, and before I could stop myself, I pulled her into a hug. She leaned into me, her arms wrapping around my waist as we stood there in the quiet warmth of the kitchen. It wasn't a perfect solution, not yet. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many hurdles we'd have to face. But in that moment, it didn't matter. We had made a choice, and that choice felt like the first step towards something real, something worth fighting for.
Chapter 30. The Farewell. The last day of our visit arrived too quickly, carrying with it a bittersweet weight. Keira had spent the morning running around the garden, completely unaware of the ticking clock. I envied her innocence, her ability to be so wholly present, as if the world beyond these moments didn't exist. Dan and I, on the other hand, were quieter. We moved through the house together, packing bags, folding clothes, and avoiding the obvious truth. This trip, as beautiful as it had been, was coming to an end. Keira burst into the kitchen, her face flushed with excitement. "Mommy, can we stay longer? I don't want to leave." Her words were like a knife to my heart, but I knelt down and pulled her into a hug. "I know, sweetie," I said softly. "I don't want to leave either, but we'll come back one day, okay? I promise." Her big, tear-filled eyes looked up at me. "You promise?" I nodded, brushing her hair back from her face. "I promise, Keira." Dan leaned against the counter, watching us with a look I couldn't quite read. There was something in his eyes that mirrored my own feelings, a mixture of hope and sadness, of wanting to hold on to this moment, but knowing it wasn't possible. We spent the afternoon walking along the beach, letting Keira collect one last handful of shells to take home. The waves crashed softly against the shore, the horizon stretching endlessly before us. I couldn't help but wonder what lay beyond it, what the future held for me, for Keira, and for Dan. When it was finally time to leave, Dan helped load our suitcases into the car, his movements slower than usual. I could see the effort it took for him to keep his composure, and it mirrored my own struggle. Keira climbed into her car seat, clutching her little bag of shells tightly. I turned to Dan, my heart aching at the thought of saying goodbye. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "For everything. For showing us this place. For making this trip so special." Dan looked at me, his eyes filled with something unspoken. "You don't have to thank me, Lara. Having you here, it meant everything to me." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away, unwilling to let them fall. "This isn't goodbye forever," I said, forcing a smile. "We'll figure it out, Dan. We'll make it work." He nodded, his jaw tightening as he tried to keep his own emotions in check. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we will." As I climbed into the car, I looked back at him one last time. He stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, the ocean behind him. It was a sight I wanted to burn into my memory, a piece of him I could carry with me no matter how far apart we were. Keira waved enthusiastically from the back seat. "Bye, Uncle Dan. I love you." Dan's face softened, and he waved back, his voice steady despite the emotion I could see in his eyes. "I love you too, Keira. Take care of your mom for me, okay?" As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back in the rearview mirror. Dan grew smaller and smaller until he was just a figure on the horizon, but the feeling of him stayed with me. The drive to the airport was quiet. Keira fell asleep, clutching her shells, and I sat in silence, my thoughts spinning. This wasn't the end of our story. It couldn't be. I didn't know how we would make it work, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't ready to let Dan go.
Chapter 31. After the Goodbye. The house felt impossibly quiet after Lara and Keira left. The echoes of their laughter still lingered in the halls, but the warmth they'd brought with them was gone, replaced by an ache I couldn't ignore. I spent the evening pacing the garden, Keira's tiny footprint still visible in the dirt where she'd run earlier that morning. The shells she'd collected sat in a small pile on the porch, forgotten in the rush to leave. I picked one up, running my thumb over its smooth surface, and smiled despite the heaviness in my chest. For years I'd wondered what it would feel like to see Lara again, to reconnect with her and discover whether the bond we'd shared as kids could withstand the weight of time. Now I had my answer. It could. But what came next? I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, its golden light casting long shadows across the fields. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Lara. "We're at the airport. Keira's asking if we can come back soon. I told her I'd love to. I hope that's okay." I couldn't help but chuckle. Of course it's okay, I thought to myself as I typed a reply. "You two are welcome here anytime. I mean that." Her response came quickly. "We'll hold you to that." For the rest of the evening, we exchanged messages, the conversation flowing as easily as it had during their visit. Lara told me about Keira's excitement at seeing the plains, how she kept talking about the big rocks at the cliffs and the treasures she'd found on the beach. But beneath the light-hearted messages, I could sense the same longing I felt. The visit had been more than just a reunion. It was the start of something we both wanted, but neither of us knew how to navigate. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about what Lara had said the evening before she left. "We'll figure it out." Her words had been so simple, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I didn't want this to be the end. I didn't want us to drift apart again, to let life get in the way of something that felt so real, so right. The solution wasn't clear, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let her slip away again. I had spent too many years wondering what could have been. Now, I had a chance to find out. The next morning, I made a list. It was practical, grounded in reality, but full of hope. I would work harder to finalize the game, push the funding, and secure a release date. And once I did, I would make the trip to the States to see Lara and Keira, because this time, I wasn't leaving anything to chance.
Chapter 32. A new chapter begins. The flight back to the States felt longer than it should have, each mile adding to the weight of leaving Dan behind. Keira was her usual bundle of energy, flipping through the pages of her coloring book and excitedly recounting every detail of our trip to the passengers nearby. But for me, the closer we got to home, the more my thoughts lingered on what we had left behind. When we landed, the rush of familiar routines swept us up immediately. Unpacking, groceries, getting Keira settled back into her playgroup. But no matter how busy things got, my mind kept wandering back to South Africa. To the cliffs, the beaches, the quiet evenings on Dan's porch, and the look in his eyes when he told me he wanted to try. That night, after Keira was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at my phone. Dan had texted earlier to ask if we'd arrived safely, and I had replied with a quick update. But now I wanted to say more. I started typing, my fingers hovering over the screen as I hesitated. Finally, I hit send. "I miss it already. And you?" The 3 dots appeared almost instantly, and my heart raced as I waited for his reply. "I miss you too, both of you. I've been thinking about how to make this work." I stared at the words, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. The practical side of me knew how complicated this was. Living in different countries, raising a child, balancing our lives, but the part of me that had spent years wondering what if didn't care about the obstacles. "Me too," I wrote back. "Maybe it's time we stop wondering and start trying." Dan's response came quickly. "I couldn't agree more. I've started planning already. Finalizing the game, securing the funding. Once it's ready, I'll come to you, Lara. I'll come to see what our future could look like." I felt tears prick at my eyes as I read his words. It was a promise, not just to me, but to us. In the weeks that followed, we fell into a rhythm of long-distance connection. We talked almost every day, sharing updates on our lives and planning for what came next. Keira, of course, continued to ask about Dan, drawing pictures of him and their adventures in South Africa. One evening, as we talked, Dan said something that stuck with me. "It doesn't matter how far apart we are, Lara. We've already waited this long. What's a little more time when we know what we're working toward?" He was right. The time apart didn't matter. What mattered was the choice we had made, to stop looking back and to start building something new. As I sat on the porch that night, the stars shining bright above me, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The past would always be part of our story, but now we were writing a new chapter. And this time I knew how it would end, with us together wherever the future decided to take us. The end. We hope you enjoyed this audiobook inspired by true friendship. We welcome you to visit our website at www.mythicmasters.org.za to find out more about the actual game Daniel is creating. Bye for now. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. This way you will be informed as soon as I have created and posted a new audiobook. I hope you have a wonderful day further and hope to see you soon.